Today, we're going to talk about the forms of business. And in this module in particular, we're going to talk about partnerships as well. And then we're going to have the next module talk about other forms of business. So we are actually entering a 2-week phase where you're going to get to focus on maybe starting your own business. So I guess the way to look at it is twofold. One, you might be starting your own business someday, and the other is you're probably working in a business, whether that is a business that you're an employee, or maybe you are an owner, or even you could be a customer and you're working with a business as a business partner, or even actually somebody who's affected by a business. So any role you have, it's going to be important to know things about liability, limited liability in particular, and that's probably my favorite feature of business as both an appeal if you're the owner, but also a warning if you are a customer or a business partner. So it's going to be really important to know what the form of business is, not just what it is. So if you say to me, I want to own a restaurant someday or a consulting business, the first thing I'll say is what form? And then we get to things like, and here they are. I look at the three primary forms of business as partnership, sole proprietorship, and corporation. And then we have all these, I'll say newfangled, although they're not so new, forms where it's kind of like a hybrid. It's taken some of the maybe appealing features. I was going to say best features, but actually part of my lesson to you is what's best depends on you and what you're interested in your needs. I may say liability, limited liability is the best feature because that's how I look at the world and I see what happens when there's not limited liability, all the hazards financially and all from the real hazards of somebody perhaps being injured. And those are the kinds of concerns that I have when I look at things. But with you, we're going to look at what all those factors are that would be important to you as your best features. And then some of these hybrid businesses will pull out some of those features and make another entity, another form of business that has it. And so I'm putting in that category limited partnerships and LLP LLC, which is a limited liability partnership and a limited liability company. It's not a corporation, but both of those two have the entire entity with limited liability. This is a very important thing that I'm starting to tell you about and bringing you in gently when I super scare you by telling you what we really mean by it in a moment. Okay, so that is what we have for the limited liability feature. And then there's also an S corporation, which has the tax feature that a lot of people find appealing when it's a pass-through entity, which we'll get to in a moment as well. So you'll know, okay, with S Corp, the big deal there is that we're having some kind of special tax feature that's different than a regular corporation, which some people call a C Corp. Okay, let's look at those features. And what we're looking at now are the ways that you might define how it is that you're going to pick your business. What are the things to think about at the beginning of a business? And so when I'm talking about limited liability, let's start with that first, because that's something that I think most people, not just me, would think are important aspects to consider. Okay, so there's two kinds of liability: limited liability and unlimited liability. Limited liability means that if you were to have any kind of loss, maybe somebody slips and falls in your restaurant, and we've learned already that's a tort, they might sue you for that injury, and perhaps the business itself will cover that loss, or insurance. Very important, I want to emphasize, if you do own a business, you should have insurance every way you can. And even as a homeowner, as a, I guess, segue from torts, remember things can go wrong, the garden hose and all of the rest that you might slip and fall, or somebody in your vicinity might and then sue you, more importantly, right? Because then you'd be liable. That means that there could be a civil lawsuit for money damages. And so you want to get insurance as most you can to protect you. But perhaps the insurance policy doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover the type of injury or the type of maybe negligence that gave rise to the injury. It was really reckless what you had done with that wet floor without roping it off. And so maybe your insurance policy isn't going to cover that, as they often don't, because they don't let you shift your responsibility to that third party insurance company. And so you're going to be liable for that. Well, I say you're going to be liable. Will your business assets be enough to cover. This might be a $5 million judgment or settlement that's against your company. And if the company is a limited liability company of any form, we're going to look at those. It could be a corporation, it could be an LLC, an LLP. In that situation, the most you could lose is how much the business has as assets, which could be substantial. Okay. But let's contrast that with an unlimited personal liability situation. Now, some people just call it unlimited liability, and so I'll put the personal in parentheses. I call it, and I've seen it, of course, written in full as unlimited personal liability. And keeping that personal in there in parentheses reminds you this does feel very personal because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about coming after your assets. So if there's not enough money in the business, then the creditor, if it was maybe something for default on a loan, the victim plaintiff, right, in a lawsuit like we just described, that person or company is coming after all of your assets. That would include your personal bank account, your house, your car, any property that you own would be up for grabs until that judgment is satisfied, okay, until you've paid off the entire amount of the judgment. So if you don't have an insurance policy at all, or if it doesn't cover the full amount or doesn't cover perhaps the type of wrongdoing that led to this money judgment against you, then we're talking about a substantial amount of money potentially. And that's super scary. So if you're a little bit super scared now, that's okay. You're better off being scared now and taking steps to form a business that will protect you from that situation. And that is the limited liability feature. And if you're wondering, well, what kinds of business have that unlimited, super scary liability? It would be a sole proprietorship, a general partnership, and even to some extent a limited partnership, because there, in a limited partnership, it's different than an LLP or LLC. A limited partnership, you have at least one general partner who has the unlimited personal liability. So basically, is left holding the bag if things go wrong. And then you have limited partners who are just sort of like silent investors, the same as maybe a shareholder in a big corporation would be in the stock that you own. See, now that's a great example. If this is a person who is an owner of the business because you own shares in a corporation, the most you could lose is the money that you invested in that business, which would be your shares of stock. They're not coming after your bank accounts and all the rest. Actually, I'm going to give you, when we look at corporations, a big exception to that. So stay tuned. But as a general rule, your assets, your personal assets, are protected because we think of the corporation as separate from you. And so whatever money the corporation loses is where it ends, because it is one of those entities that has a limited liability feature. So that's a big one. Another big feature I think that people take under serious consideration in trying to decide what form of business is appealing to them. Remember, you already might be a restaurant owner or a consulting firm of some sort, right? But we're talking about, well, what legal construct, what is the entity that you are creating, and how do you create it? So we're going to look at that, and you're going to go through the module and figure out from learning, how it is that we form them. But that might be a factor for you. So let's look at that factor. It might be that you want to have it be super easy to form. And so, if that was the case, you would go with one of those simplest forms of business, like a sole proprietorship or a general partnership. You don't need any kind of special blessing to form it. You decide you're going to go out and do the business, you do it. That's a sole proprietorship. And in a general partnership, you have one or more people who's doing it with you, and you have an agreement to do it. Doesn't even have to be an agreement in writing when it's a partnership. So that's also easy to do, and you go out and do it. But remember, again, you've got that very scary kind of liability. And here's how I kind of look at that as well. One of the factors is managerial control. And you may say to me, I want to just go out there and do it. I want to create my business and I want to have control over all the important decisions that need to be made. And so I'm going to be the owner, either the sole owner or owner with my friends who are my partners. Okay. And if that's the case, great. But here's how a good way to remember it: with great control comes great liability. It's kind of my spin on Spider-Man, right? My Spider-Man spin, in the sense that there it was with great power comes great responsibility. So here it's with great control, great managerial control comes great liability. Two sides of the same coin. And so if you want that control, but you don't want the liability, you might consider, well, I'll take those extra steps. That might be a little bit of time and money and a little bit of paperwork, but I will form one of these other forms of business like a corporation or an LLC, LLP. And I've mentioned those two quickly, and you'll, of course, look at them further, but I'll tell you, those are the limited liability entities. And a LLP, LLC, what's the difference? One is for more professionals. And this is, even though that P stands for partnership, I want you to think of it as easy to remember if you think of, well, that's professionals, the P. So, for instance, doctors, lawyers, or accountants, when they form that limited entity kind of business, and it's not a corporation, it's called a limited liability partnership, LLP. And they file in each state is going to be a different filing requirement, what papers you'd actually file. And it may be a filing fee. It may not be so cumbersome to do that. And that's why one reason why LLPs and LLCs are very popular. LLC is the same kind of a thing where it's a limited entity in terms of the whole liability. You file your fee and your paper, and you look up each state's law to see where you want to file it, and that you follow those requirements for that particular state. And an LLC could be even for one person owning it. So if you were to say to me, well, I want to have a construction business, and it's just going to be me who owns it, or me and 10 other people. And it's small, we don't want to do a whole big corporation. Then I might suggest to you, if I were giving you legal advice, which I'm not, because it's your decision, but I might suggest that you strongly consider an LLC, because in that situation, what you would like to do is avoid the kind of scary scenario that I gave you. And when I think of a construction business, because I'm a lawyer, the first thing I think of is, oh, think about all the things that could go wrong, injuries on the job, and the crane falls and causes damage. And I'm already thinking ahead to the inevitable potential lawsuits. And so I would advise, whoa, you might really want to limit your personal liability and pick one of those entities that will give you that. And since you don't want maybe the formality of a corporation, you could very easily do an LLC. And that's one of the reasons LLCs are so popular. And the last thing I'm going to tell you about for factors, and then of course you're going to jump in and learn more about these forms of business. I'm just giving you the very overview and intro for it. But the other thing I want to mention is taxation. As I said before, some people are focused on that, and it is absolutely a factor you want to know about. And so we call this single tax or double tax. If the entity is a single tax entity, what that means is it's a pass-through entity. The taxes that you pay are on your personal income tax, and therefore you would have that tax as if it was in your pocket. And what that means is that you are paying tax whether you receive that money in your pocket or not. So you're paying tax on the profit of the business, and it's your portion. So if there's three of you, you're each paying a third. If it was a partnership, for instance, a general partnership, or even LLP or LLC, you would be then having that tax be on your portion, your pro rata share of the profit. Now, it might be a year that you really aren't taking any money out. It's a startup and you're putting the money in and you're really not receiving it. You still pay tax because the IRS doesn't view the entity as a separate taxable entity. And that's what we mean by pass through. It kind of is invisible, and the tax goes directly, the paying of the tax, so the portion of your profit that you're paying tax on is directly with the individuals that are the owners of that company. Okay. And then a double tax is what you have in a corporation, a general type of corporation, like I said, the C Corp, because there, what you have is that you are only paying tax as an owner on what you receive. And if you are an owner of a corporation, you are a shareholder, right? And so where do you get your revenue? Where do you get your actual money that you receive? I'm waiting for the answer, but I'm sure it came right to your mind. Your dividends. Okay, that's a distribution of the share of profits to the shareholders, to the owners, and that is the portion you're paying tax on. You're not paying tax on your 1/100th or whatever that may be. of your ownership share of the entire corporation's profit. Instead, the corporation pays a separate tax. So there's two taxes. That's a double tax. It may not be a total bill that's more. It's just double because it's taxing the corporation at that level and then the individual owners as to what they actually receive. So that's sort of an overview. You're going to see when we do corporations, there are ways to limit that total tax bill, very creative ways that are still very legal to have your total profit that's on the book be less because we can take things that are expenses and depreciate them or even deduct them right from the expenses. The expenses come off of the sales and there we get our profit. That's what's taxed on. And so we're going to look at that. We do corporations. You're going to look at different exceptions to that unlimited liability of corporations. Remember, I said an S Corp is a special one for tax purposes. So we'll just end with that to say that's a type of corporation that's a single pass-through entity, like I described for those other forms of business. So unlike the C Corp, the regular corporation that we look at, that one, the owners decided, and in that there's other requirements that you'll see, like the number of owners, it's essentially small, it's under 100, and they decide unanimously they want to file for subchapter S of the IRS, and that means they file a form that says there'll be a single tax, which could be good, could be bad. That's why they have to all agree, because you are paying tax then on your pro rata share as you would do if this was a general partnership. Okay. And maybe you receive the money, you don't mind paying tax, or maybe it's actually a loss. This is true for any of this, in which case, if you could take it off your personal income tax, offsets other income, that would be a benefit in terms of tax. So that's something that you will learn way more about. This is just your very briefest intro. And when you do go through and learn in this module and the next, I'd like you to think about it, file it away, because you may own a business someday. And if you don't, you may be working for a business, I hope, or if you want to. And so it's really good to know what the legal entity is behind the type of business. And you'll be able to have that come to mind. And if you're a third party, a person who's tripping and falling or doing business with that business, you'll want to know too about especially the liability feature. So stay tuned and enjoy learning about these very useful things that you very most likely will use in your future.